Thank you all. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to everyone who presented their papers and worked at this conference. You are all truly brilliant and inspiring. And I am humbled to be here and present one of the papers that I co-authored with Gianclaudio on the meaning of vulnerability within the AI Act. So in order to understand what vulnerability may mean within the AI Act, I will walk you through why we chose this as a topic, where and how you will find the term hidden within the regulation, and ultimately the version of or our interpretation that I am happy to hear your feedback on. All right, so why have we chosen to focus on human vulnerability? Well, on the one side, there is the richness that hides behind the term. We have all felt vulnerable, or maybe we have seen or experienced situations that render us vulnerable. Academics have also raised the question of who can be vulnerable, and they suggest a difference between understanding vulnerability as a universal experience as opposed to perhaps only some groups being vulnerable, or maybe the truth being somewhere in the middle. In addition, if you describe a situation as containing vulnerability, you, of course, also imply that that person in that situation might need help. So it also has a moral and political imperative. The term does have legal meaning in that it is present across different legislatory instruments across the EU. In particular, within the AI Act, the term is a risk categorization tool, as AI systems that exploit vulnerabilities may be prohibited. In addition, if your AI system is thought to be essentially rendering someone in a vulnerable position, you may then be categorized as a high-risk AI. Well, not you personally, but the AI system. And additionally, enforcement agencies need to take account of the effects of an AI system, again, on people experiencing vulnerability. So its relevance spans across the regulation. And then you may wonder, how can that be? Well, there are 17 total references to the term within the Act. These references we have regrouped because they are not linguistically similar, and we derived 6 formulations and derivatives. To each of these formulations, the regulator has then associated some examples, which I will then show you in a visual. Nevertheless, despite the role that I just mentioned, and despite the amount of references, there is no clear definition that the regulator has provided that fits all of the references. As we will see, there is one associated with one particular references, but there are some problems there. So how does this look like? These are our groupings of the reference. On the other side, you will see the associated articles and recitals. And what will be more interesting for you will be the associations with the examples. So to look at 2 references in particular, an individual may be in a vulnerable position, and we can understand their vulnerable position by looking at their socioeconomic background. We can understand them as being in a vulnerable position if they are a migrant, or if they are interacting with an AI system within public administration structures. At the same time, vulnerable groups may be understood in relation to demographic examples, such as age or ethnicity. As I said, the European Union has given us a slight hint of what vulnerability might mean, but they have done so on the basis of the prohibition within their prohibition guidelines. So they suggest that vulnerability might be a form of susceptibility, a susceptibility that the individual has and that will ultimately affect the way that they make informed decisions or their behavior. And as I said, while this definition might fit the prohibition itself, there are some issues when you look at the other examples and references. For instance, this definition does not take into account the underlying power imbalances. So the relations between, for instance, the individuals, the entity that is making a decision, and the mediating factor of the technology. It also doesn't take into account that decisions can be made about individuals. So it's not only about the individual making a decision themselves, but you can be rendered vulnerable if a decision is issued that is unfavorable to you. Thirdly, it really does not account at all for our own agency, our own resilience, or the structural availabilities. that we have to mitigate some of the risks and harms. So then you may wonder, how can we understand vulnerability within the AI Act? For us, vulnerability can be defined as the higher risk to fundamental rights that results from power imbalance dependencies, as well as personal or structural levels of resilience. If this may seem like a mouthful, bear with me for just a couple more minutes because I will present a couple of visuals that may help make this definition more clear. All right, so the higher risk to fundamental rights is, as I said, due to power imbalance dependencies, personal elements, as well as resilience. To start with personal elements here, you may associate vulnerability to matters of demographics or semi-immutable characteristics such as knowledge, age, language, health, and the list can go on. When it comes to power imbalance dependencies, there are two sides to the story. The first is that an individual is always vulnerable or dependent on someone or something. So there is an interpersonal dimension. Think, for instance, the dependency that you feel on your employer, or as I said, public administration services. And this dependency is specific to a certain context. So that will be the structural dimension. Think, for example, really technological advancements, so the use of AI, for example, or the market structure. On the other side, the final element is resilience. So we may think of resilience from the personal perspective, our own availabilities in terms of resources or capital in order to manage a situation once the harm has occurred, but it can also be structural. So for example, the availability of rights, data subject rights or the right to explanation puts us in a position and gives us even more power towards the people or the entities towards which we feel a power imbalance. And with that, I am quite on time, I believe, because this is actually how all of the elements are related to one another and how our definition can be viewed. I will also leave you with the actual picture that you will see in the paper, just so that there is no unclarity. It looks like this. And I welcome your feedback, your questions. I thank you for your attention, and I hope that you will get in touch. Thank you.